saying it's going to be recording.
Okay. Well,
Okay, now
anyway,
you can. Yeah.
I'm Dave Siegel. I have a long-term interest in cryptography and how it affects history, both in a diplomatic and military sense. What I'm talking about is outlined on the slide. I would appreciate it if something I say isn't clear, please feel free to interrupt. But otherwise, if you want to discuss the import of something, I propose we should do that best at the end of the talk. So what I want to talk about now is something that's not generally well known, although it's becoming well known. It was revealed within the last couple of years, and I maintain that just as no one can write a history that's informative about the Second World War without discussing cryptanalysis, no one will be able to discuss the history of the latter part of the 20th century without including the cryptographic element. So I'd like to start by giving a background. What was cryptography like emerging from World War II, and how did the principles treat it? Then I'd like to introduce two very interesting personalities that turned out to be the center of this story. This is a very human story involving the interaction between two flawed professional men. Then I'd like to introduce a particular cipher machine whose checkered history was very basic to the whole operation. I'd like to show how the operation came about through a gentleman's agreement. Then I'd like to deal with the sequelae in detail, showing what it achieved, illustrating some internal tensions it developed, give an idea of how it fell apart, and then a couple of final thoughts, some unintended consequences of this sort of operation, and the final thoughts on both the expediency and morality of it. So where was cryptography at the end of World War II? World War II established the critical importance of this. The Allies knew that cryptography could make the difference between defeat and success. And both the US and the UK in particular had huge cryptanalytical establishments. There were well over 10,000 people involved in cryptanalysis at the end of the war. By the way, I'm sorry, cryptanalysis is the study of codes and ciphers and the methods used to break them. The achievements were mostly known to the Soviets, and the USSR, it's becoming clear in last years, had its own series of successes against Enigma. We hadn't known about that, but they had managed to break Enigma on their own. And it knew a lot about the USA's work through espionage, and the UK was pretty much an open book. However, the victorious Allies generally classified their cryptanalytical successes. For instance, the US essentially tried to classify as much as possible about cryptanalysis, so the theory of cryptanalysis itself. This was an uncanny analog to what happened in nuclear science, but that's beyond the pale of the talk. The US decision makers in particular had been traumatized by Pearl Harbor and were determined we'll never be surprised like that again. It was hoped that cryptanalysis would refine warning of a surprise nuclear attack, which of course would be infinitely worse than what happened at Pearl Harbor. World War II had been a true world war. The actions of secondary powers and neutrals and small nations in general had occasionally been crucial. Examples include Spain, Iceland, Norway, Switzerland, Vichy France, Iran, and others. At times, the signal traffic of those countries was of intense interest. At the end of the war, there were tensions between the former allies that were starting to develop. By the end of the 40s, the USSR was widely seen as the principal enemy in Western Europe. And there were even tensions between the closer of the powers, the UK and France versus the USA, during the Suez Crisis, for example, in 1956. The old empires crudely were trying to reestablish themselves. That wasn't necessarily in the US's interest. The second sequelae of decolonization was there were a lot of newly born nations. And because newborn nations, like other nations, have embassies at the UN, if nowhere else, they sought cryptographic equipment. Nevertheless, the years between 45 and 52 were the dark ages of American cryptology. according to a leaked CIA report. And I really like this phrase that really highlights it. When Eisenhower became president in 1952, American cryptologists were reading none of the high-level ciphers of their three principal enemies, which were the USSR, the People's Republic of China, and North Korea. Some reasons for that is in the never-ending arms race between cipher making and cipher breaking, the cipher makers had clearly won. As I said at the end of as I illustrated at the end of the last talk, it was now possible to make cipher machines like the World War II Sagaba or the Soviet Fialka or the American KL7, which were effectively unbreakable if you didn't have access to key lists and detailed knowledge of the machine. KL7 is a story by itself. This machine was notorious, was rampantly breached, but that's because somebody gave the wiring and the key lists on a regular basis to the Soviets. The advent of electronic encryption also is part of this trend. One quote from the CIA report, as given in this Baltimore Sun in 1995, was, "The Pentagon's research chief solemnly informed the director in 1961 that encryption was improving so fast that the NSA would be out of business in 5 years. They wouldn't be able to crack other people's codes." Soviet espionage had revealed both US and UK successes, so the Soviet cryptography improved greatly, and essentially their traffic became unreadable. Also, they used internal lines as opposed to just broadcasting their messages across the Soviet Union, so people didn't have access to their traffic. So basically, US cryptographers were desperate for successes to bolster their credibility in the US intelligence community, because that was always a den of battling bureaucracies, as it is in any nation. So let me introduce to you first William F. Friedman, who, if you were at the last talk, you might remember. William F. Friedman is a sort of a heroic figure in the US. He more or less single-handedly dragged the US into a cryptographic modernity. He personally revolutionized the field by applying statistics to cryptography, and he developed very powerful tools to break ciphers and codes. He is an odd bird. He started out in genetics, but a bizarre twist of fate landed him at a private think tank, trying to help the members of the think tank prove that Shakespeare was not the author of Shakespeare, that essentially the real author, another author, had written it and had left encrypted hints about his identity in the play. And very much unlike the expectations of them, Friedman and his wife, who were both cryptographers, debunked those claims. He essentially became important in military cryptography in World War I, and his importance grew as his achievements grew. And because of this man, we entered the Second War with an effective cryptographic establishment that avoided a disaster like the Enigma was to the German military. Particularly, he oversaw the development and adoption of Sagaba, as well as units that broke the Japanese codes like red, coral, and purple. He was subsequently referred to within the community as the Dean of the American Cryptography, and he was essentially idealized by parts of it. Now, his work brought him into contact with a Swedish fellow named Boris Hagelin. Hagelin was a Swedish mechanical engineer, and fate left him in charge of development of cipher machines for a company, and he became really good at it. He discovered he had a true aptitude for it. It's difficult in a small number of words to give his proper impact upon cryptography, because he designed a series of machines known as lug machines, which essentially dominated most of commercial cryptography, and is the only man up until the 1990s who ever made any money at cryptography. Friedman and Hagelin admired one another professionally. Hagelin once wrote that Friedman said that he once said he'd been asked if it was necessary to be insane to work in cryptography, and he answered, well, not necessary, but it helps. The same could be said about me and my penchant for the design of ciphering machines. We both suffered from depressions, but never at the same time, so we could help each other. This friendship developed professionally, and in a way it was a friendship between a master cipher maker, William Friedman, and a master cipher maker, master cipher breaker, who is Friedman, and a master cipher maker, who is Hagelin. Hagelin becomes important to the story very early on. He developed portable, secure cipher machines for the French army and for other customers within Europe. And he was very good at what he did. He made one model, the C-36 for the French, and he sent it to the US and it went to Friedman for the evaluation. Friedman was impressed. He made suggestions for improvements, and Hagelin incorporated some in the subsequent models. In 1940, Germany invaded Norway. Fearing what was going to go on in Sweden, Hagelin went to the US, and in his luggage were 2 dismantled C-36 machines. Hagelin polished the design in the USA, in part with Friedman's suggested improvements, and ended up selling the rights to the US government for no less than $8 million, of which about 1.8 million went to Hagelin personally after tax. That'd be worth about $38 million today in 2023. That cipher machine became the US Army's M209 and the Navy's CSP 1500. We don't have to dwell on the tales, but these machines became the mainstay of American cryptography during the war. They were not the most secure machines. They were certainly the most frequently used. So this is the little machine that started it all in a way. Unlike Enigma and Sagaba, the M209 was not a rotor machine. It was a hand-operated pin and lug cipher machine. It produced a Zwinner-type cipher, that is, a selection between 26 different reversed alphabets. The idea, though, was although the number of available alphabets was small, the sequence determined which alphabet was in use for each and every character was very long. The machine had a period exceeding 100 million. David Kahn called it a little jewel of a cipher machine. It weighed only 3 pounds, and it was the size of a small lunchbox. This was a great advantage for a tactical cipher machine because you didn't have to lug a huge machine around with you and was easy to use. Here's a blow-up of it. In what follows, it's not necessarily, I'm not going to go into the details of how the machine operates, although I'll give you references that give you very approachable and very concise summaries of that. But if you can see the post, can you see the cursor? The output of the cipher device, you put in the letter you want to encipher here, like W, and the letter that's the cipher output is put out on this pinwheel. And this idea that the pinwheel is rotated with respect to the input wheel by a certain amount, 3 on one character, 2 on the second, 15 on the third, 8 on the fourth, and so forth and so on. And the amount of those displacements of this wheel versus this one is what is generated by the whole rest of the machinery on the slide. Basically, it consists of 2 elements. These are a bunch of sliding bars with lugs on them. This is called a cage, and this wheel in the upper part of the device rotates once for every encipherment. And as it rotates, you'll notice these lugs on these parallel bars. These lugs interact with these pinwheels through these gears. If a lug is lined up with a particular pinwheel, and a pin on that wheel at that position is effective, the lug will turn the wheel. So every time each pinwheel, each of these cogs turns a certain number of times. The number of displacements of the print head here are determined by how many slide bars are active in shifted length, shifted left. That will give you a little, this will be a little clearer. Yeah, sure.
Just wanted to ask, you said
Sure.
the expression per encipherment. Are you saying the top cage spins once every 26 letters?
No, once every letter. This is very much unlike a rotor machine. I know it's a little different than what I talked about last time.
So every letter, that thing goes all the way around.
All the way around.
Okay, got it.
So let's look at the parts of the device individually. I talked about these pinwheels. These are wheels with little pins on them, which determines whether this pin is effective or ineffective at changing the number of slide bars that are slid left. If there's a pin in a certain position here, then this lever is not available to interact with these lugs. If there is no pin at that position, and each position can have the pin in or out, set in or out, that's set at the beginning of the encipherment, then this essential little pawl can, if there's a lug there, it intersects with the lug and shoves the entire bar to the right, to the left. If the bar is shoved to the left, it forms a part of a variable gear. So if at the end of an incitement there are 6 bars slid to the left, this little pinwheel is displaced 6 places. I know this is a lot to drink in one setting. Here is an expanded view of the machine. It's merely necessary to know that this machine was very good as a tactical machine. And the strengths where it was theoretically quite secure. That is, there's something like, there's something like a key space of 201 bits or 3.2 times 10 to the 60th. There are a lot of ways, possible ways to set up the machine. So essentially a problem of a decipher would be finding out which one of those 3 times 10 to the 60th settings was in use. Theoretically, it was quite secure. It was small and light, so you can drag it around with the rest of your pack very easily. One thing I find good for a laugh is that these little things are pigeon capsules. So you can write out a little message on a tape and attach it to the leg of the pigeon. But that's another story. The machine was reciprocal, so you could both encrypt and decipher ciphertext with no extensive rearrangements to the machine. And that's very convenient in use, because if you're sending messages every few minutes and receiving messages every few minutes, you don't have to do a lot of rearranging to your machine. It saves time. Even though it was reciprocal, unlike with the Enigma, a letter can be enciphered as itself, so that feature doesn't degrade its security. And there's websites that deal with the M209 in particular. And quotes for them are well used. That's hard to do in wartime because there's massive signal traffic. The M209 can provide very good security. There are a couple of sources on this, but essentially they agree that if the messages are kept to a matter of 400 characters each with each message key, then the machine cannot be deciphered even with modern computers. If you run into an M209 message in the historical record and you don't know the settings of the machine and you don't have a crib, you are out of luck, even with modern computer-based attack. Here was the weaknesses. So this machine is theoretically so strong. In the event, it turned out to be vulnerable. Why was that? It's a small thing, so changing the key was awkward. You had to be a little bit of a jeweler to change the settings of the pins on each of the wheels. If the enemy found large numbers of messages all enciphered using the same daily and same message keys, they could put the messages in depth and read all the messages with those settings. Total alignments of maybe a few thousand characters was sufficient. So that may sound strange, but for instance, if too many people chose the same message settings, which were the initial positions of the pinwheels, as AAA on a given day, people might begin to read, the enemy might begin to read those messages. Worse, the indicators, which told what the initial pin settings and pinwheel settings for the messages weren't encrypted. And in retrospect, that just seems like a horrible error, because if you knew what the indicators were, you could bring a lot of messages into alignment more easily. Importantly, the regular rotation of all the pinwheels potentiated known plaintext attack. All the pinwheels rotated one position for each character. So this is not bedtime reading, but there's been an article in Cryptologia which describes how you can break into M209 if you have a trustworthy crib or known plaintext of about 75 characters. It's not simple and it's not guaranteed, but it does seem to work. More importantly, William Friedman evaluated the machine initially, and he said, geez, it's theoretically quite secure, but it's too easy to select keys by mistake that are particularly susceptible to analysis. For instance, a naively chosen lug combination made the cipher more vulnerable. So certain settings emphasize certain wheel settings. It was possible to set up the machine so that it was vulnerable. The US may have discovered several ciphertext analysis methods which are secret. That's the story has been told in a report. I'll get to the origin of this report in a minute. A researcher at Bell Labs said that once he and some colleagues came up with a ciphertext-only attack method on the M209 that could solve messages of a couple of thousand characters with no knowledge of the key settings or what the messages said. They wanted to publish it. NSA objected, saying they were told the principle was applicable to machines then still in use by foreign governments. And I found a 1950 NSA meeting in the Friedman archive that seems to confirm that. So it's possible the USA found ways to read the machine that are still secret. But sorry for talking so much about this one machine. We're almost done with the eccentricities of this one machine. But what were the consequences of the US use of this? Well, it turned out after the US entered the war, the Italians had been using the same machine for a while, and the British were reading some of the Italian traffic. And they kind of pulled the sleeve to the Americans saying, this is not a very secure machine, don't use it. And it proved that Friedman had been right all along. Yeah, it's theoretically unbreakable, but when you give it to a few million GIs, someone's going to make a mistake. And someone's going to make a mistake among a few million people fairly often. And throughout the war, both British and American code breakers were able to read Hegelian traffic, both from their enemies and their allies. After the war, it was discovered that they weren't alone, that the Germans had been able to read about 10% of the American Hegelian traffic. The problem was that due to the amount of work involved in breaking the messages, and the Germans did not use particularly good methods, the decrypts became available after about 7 to 10 days. So if a message on Wednesday said attack tomorrow at dawn, and you read that message a week later, it might not be of immediate use to you. So at the end of the war, many combatants in the US in World War II, that's the Allies certainly, Germany to some extent, France to some extent, knew that these machines were too insecure for high security traffic. But their own cryptographic successes and failures were classified. Most other countries didn't know that. They were the only ones, the Allies, who knew that the M209s were potentially readable. There were 140,000 M209 machines floating around in the US after the war. Some appeared on in catalogs for sale for $2 each. So many nations were clamoring for better crypto systems, including new nations. Now, the bifurcation here is interesting. The US began to supply M209s to other nations, including secondary European nations and neutrals, because they wanted to be able to read those people's cryptologic traffic. Meanwhile, in contrast, Hagelin, who designed it, saw there was a huge world market for more secure machines, so he set about improving it.
Hey, Dave.
Yeah.
So are you saying like each of the nations kind of figured out they could break it, but they each kept it secret? So everybody thought they were the only ones? And so they were selling them about because they could read what they were selling, but not realizing everybody else could too?
It's sort of like that. What happened was the people who were aware that the machine was pretty vulnerable, were the Americans and the British, to some extent the Germans. The cryptographic successes of all powers were classified. Even Germany's was classified. We had to go and dig them out of the records. So nobody else knew amongst secondary powers or the smaller nations that the M209 traffic was readable. Is that clear?
Yeah, I think so. You have a question. Mark has his hand raised. I don't know if you could see that.
Sure.
Yeah, thanks. There's something I did not understand before, that you were talking about the number of calculations that would be necessary for what was it, this one, yeah. But that even today, if you wanted to read something without the cipher, you couldn't, even with modern computers. So what I don't get is the Enigma machine was broken by a computer from the 40s. Why can't modern computers break something?
Actually, that's not quite true. The Enigma was broken by hand and by relatively inefficient analog computers.
Yeah, that's what I mean. Yeah.
Okay.
Computers from
the
the 40s.
problem was I'll just say this: big numbers in cryptography mean nothing. There are 3 times 10 to the 60th ways to set up M209, yet Germany read it intermittently. Okay, that's because although this is a frighteningly big number, within this key space, within the machine, there are periodicities that allow you to break messages. One analogy is it is theoretically extremely difficult to break a monoalphabetic substitution cipher, a cryptogram. Yet an intelligent 11-year-old will do it in 20 minutes.
I wish I understood that analogy.
Well,
I'm not a math. I don't know. I'm not good at math. But is it? I think what the point you're making is analogous to what a Polish mathematician did in the 30s when it came to attacking the big number, that he was able to eliminate a huge part of those numbers as they can't be the.
Yes.
Okay.
That's exactly what I mean.
Okay, I got it. Thank you.
There are methodological elements in the machine that exist that, even though there are many ways to set it up, if you have enough ciphertext, there are ways to break it.
And in both cases, with this one and with the Enigma, some of the initial successes were the fact that the human element on the other end, where the typists got lazy, or they would talk about the weather and things like that. Yeah.
And the M209 case, people were not good about changing keys, apparently. And as I said, initially the US Army didn't even encrypt the indicators, and all you can do in modern day is just shake your head and ask why.
So if you don't mind, as a subsequent question, is it true that if you didn't have the cipher for Enigma machine, computers even today, could not break it?
I can't swear that they can't break it even today. As of a couple of years ago, standard PCs, that no attack launched on a standard PC was capable of breaking them. It's a question, if the NSA really wanted to break it in modern day, I'm pretty sure they could.
Okay.
But, historians generally have access to laptops, when they're out in the field. And if you come across an Enigma message, and you don't have its key and you don't have a crib, you're pretty much out of luck.
Gotcha. Thank you.
You're welcome. Okay, so Hagelin decided he was going to improve the M209, and he succeeded brilliantly. One of the first things he did was he made the pinwheels step irregularly. One of the only attack I'm aware of on the M209 that works is because each and every pinwheel moves one space after every character. The first step was he made that pinwheel stepping irregular. It was controlled by special lugs and bars on this cage. The second thing he did immediately was, whereas the M209 had 6 immovable that you could not replace the pinwheels, Hagelin made the new machine. You could use any 6 out of 12 pinwheels. So there were 665,000 combinations. Moreover, the pinwheels were much bigger, whereas the M209 had a smaller number of pins on each wheel. For the CX2, moreover, you had many more wheels to choose from, and each was bigger. So this made the period much longer. Some models displaced the printhead by a certain amount on each rotation, but effectively, what this Hagelin started making one-time tape machines too. And the thing about a one-time tape cipher machine is it's theoretically and often effectively unbreakable. So if properly used, and Hagelin made sure they would be properly used, these units were much more secure than the M209. Now, Hagelin sent a copy of this to his friend, Bill Friedman, at the NSA, and essentially asked, what do you think of it? And when Hagelin described this to Friedman, Friedman and the NSA reacted with extreme consternation. Hear it right. And the quotes from 2 CIA reports are the most most illuminating. This one is online as part of the Friedman archive. And interestingly, it's a report internal to the NSA saying, what kind of computers do we have to build? And the line is, any CX-52 traffic that appears will tax our present facilities severely. It will require more complicated, faster motion machines, and most of the present special purpose machinery will not be applicable. Friedman was much more succinct. He said, it's an apocalyptic prospect. We will be blind within a few years. Some in the NSA were a little more arrogant about its capabilities and did not agree, but Friedman carried the day. I don't know how to analyze this machine. Now, the first response of the NSA was the first response of bureaucracies everywhere. They turned around and classified Hagelin's patent. That only infuriated Hagelin and disgusted Friedman, because Hagelin had submitted that patent in more than one nation at a time. So if you were German, for example, and wanted to find out the principle of this machine, all you had to go was to Germany, German patent office, and look at the patents. Interestingly, what happened now is that Friedman and Hagelin discussed restricting the sale of the highly secure machines. That is, Friedman or Hagelin, no one knows who, said to the other, maybe you don't have to sell this machine to everyone. Maybe you could sell it only to friends. Could we somehow come to an arrangement to pay you to do that? Friedman then proposed that the US make a formal agreement with Hagelin to limit the sale of the cipher machines that were risks only to friendly countries. This is the start of what became known as a gentleman's agreement, and the agreement grew into a subsequent program called Rubicon. Why was Friedman able to exert this influence on Hagelin? They were friends. Here, for example, is a 1952 photo of Friedman and his wife inscribed, to Boris and Annie Hagelin, with affectionate greetings. I should also point out that Elizabeth Friedman was a distinguished cryptographer in her own right. Recently, an article came out with examples of the systems she broke. Apparently, Bill held off the Axis, the Japanese and the Nazis, and she attacked the mob. Organized crime was severely scared of this woman during the 1930s and 40s because rum runners, the 1920s and 30s, because rum runners would come up with a really very complicated codes to tell each other where to be in order to transfer shipments of liquor, and she broke them like matchsticks. But anyway, back to the story. Hagelin made a proposal to the Armed Forces Security Agency, which turned into the NSA later. And the proposal was as this. Hagelin is an important player here, and we acknowledge that. The Hagelin Company is the only company on the international market that makes really serious cipher machines. But we consider that market an expanding threat. And however, Boris has been a good friend, and I think what they mean here is due to his previous history with the M209. He's buddies with Friedman, and generally he has an affinity for the West. He once tried to sell cipher machines to the Soviets. All they did was copy the machine and not pay him a dime. Hagelin's proposal, Friedman's proposal was that Hagelin can sell this machine to friendly nations, but not everyone. They'd pay him some money for that. Hagelin would provide information about what he was selling to whom. Hagelin's offices and agents abroad would be used for information gathering, and in payment, Hagelin would get a payment, but essentially NATO would consider his more secure cipher machines for use. That offered the big possibility of big contracts to Hagelin. Now, how do we know all this? At some point, the more observant of you might have been thinking, how do you know so much about stuff that is obviously secret? And there are two basic sources, and I should probably talk about them now. First of all, there are Friedman's personal papers, which he donated to the Marshall Foundation in 1967. This is a story in itself, but the NSA had really become very aggressive about trying to classify things well after the fact. They began trying to classify publications that Friedman had printed and published in the late 20s, and essentially they pissed him off. So essentially he donated all his personal papers. It's a little bit of an academic question whether he did this on purpose or not, but included in the archive were all the letters between him and Hagelin negotiating what became the gentleman's agreement. The NSA belatedly tried to reclassify this once it found out that these things were in the public record, but at that point it was too late, and in 2015 it declassified much of this. The second sources are there was an internal CIA history of the agreement and its development, specifically a 96-page account. This was somehow acquired, and a lot of excerpts were published by the Washington Post, the German newspaper ZDF, and the Swiss Public News Agency in 2020. The German intelligence service wrote an addendum. This was also leaked and showed up in the same places. Unless otherwise attributed, quotes given below are excerpted either from the Friedman archive or the Washington Post and related accounts of the CIA report. The CIA report itself has never been fully declassified, although, as I'll show later in the source file, a lot of people seem to have copies. I can't get one, which is very infuriating. But anyway, the details of the negotiations tell a very human story about Friedman and Hagelin. They also say a lot about the organizations that did this. There was a lot of internal squabbling in the US, and the two gentlemen then agreed a gentleman's agreement. The US Armed Forces, the forces cryptographic agencies, were divided about this, whether to approach Hagelin in the first place. Essentially, they were saying, why are we telling foreigners about our crypto targets? There were power struggles between the NSA and CIA, arrogance about capabilities, and NSA's risk aversion, but all of these combined to sink the initiative. The British contacted us separately with the same concerns, and that made the NSA refloated. So in NSA, in 1953, Friedman visited Hagelin, and the two friends agreed. And they agreed essentially what was in Friedman's proposal. In addition, Hagelin said that if and when I sell this company, the US will have the right of first refusal and could approve the guy I sell it to. He even suggested that, if you're really scared of this machine, I'll let you develop the crypto heart of it so that, you can put a backdoor into it. This agreement heavily favored the US. Nevertheless, the US balked. The reasons for that are, complex, but meanwhile, the US continued to sell M209s to other nations. M209s went to Ecuador, Venezuela, Argentina, Colombia, Peru. They'd been requested by a number of nations. So nevertheless, Hagelin stuck to the terms of this agreement. In 1955, Friedman went back to Hagelin a second time, and the two friends struck a deal again. This time, the agreement would be official, and it was a little bit, the CIA had been playing hardball. Hagelin would not be paid for this. And the NSA would write the instruction manuals for the machines, for the machines sold to neutral nations. They'd encourage users to select insecure keys. To the friendly nations, the NSA would write manuals to encourage selection of very, very secure keys. It's worth pausing for a minute because in 1955, Hagelin told the CIA, the NSA, who his customer list included. The thing that leaps out at the eye is there are 31 nations total. Only 3 of these are in or on the periphery of the Eastern Bloc. 8 nations of these are allies. At the time, they were NATO allies. They would have been comrades in a shooting war. We were reading their mail. You see that a lot of these nations are areas of incipient east-west confrontation, like the Middle East and Indonesia and South America. And some pairs are long-term antagonists, like India, Pakistan, and Greece, Turkey. Those are ongoing soccer matches. You can see why we'd be interested, but the implication is that in making the gentleman's agreement, the US was much more concerned about what its own alliance members were saying amongst themselves and to others. Eavesdropping on your friends is not necessarily confidence-building practice. This was followed by even more squabbling in the US. I really like this because this is an example, I think, of Hagelin striking back. The US had been continually selling the old readable cipher machines to a lot of nations who asked for them. So Friedman visited Hagelin in 1957. Hagelin shocked him by showing him a new patent he'd just gotten in the United States. This patent was for something known as reentry. Now, even though there was a secret US patent that covered the same material, the US Patent Office overlooked it somehow and granted Hagelin a patent on this. Anyone who's ever interacted with the patent office can sympathize. They make a lot of mistakes. But this patent application was very important because it showed that Hagelin could make machines every bit as secure as the US's most secure cipher machines. Essentially, what Hagelin was doing was saying that that's a nice cipher machine you got there, but you're not the only cryptographer in the world, bitch. It'd be a shame if machines started to show up on the world market that were more secure than what you use. We don't know every detail of what happened in this regime, but in 1960, the CIA finally stopped screwing around with Hagelin and finalized the deal. Hagelin could sell any machine to friendly countries, and including Switzerland and Sweden. The agreement had a chart showing what he could sell to what countries. It would last for 5 years and be extended to 1975. The US would have patent rights to Hagelin machines with one exception. And my inference is this reentry patent was used by Hagelin as a bargaining chip, and he held on to it to ensure the CIA's good behavior. Way to go, Boris. The agency paid Hagelin $75,000 a year in retainer. That's worth $750,000 in 2023. So for over 15 years, they paid him a retirement fund, if you will, of $11,020,023. Over this time period, Friedman's health deteriorated. He pretty much drops out of the picture, and unfortunately, he dies in 1969. I'm running behind schedule, so I may come back to this. What is reentry and why might Hagelin's patent have been so scary? But I'm not sure I have time now. The post-CI developments. Hagelin began producing machines designed by the NSA. According to that CIA report, the NSA didn't install crude backdoors. They just installed subtle flaws in the algorithms, which made the machines easy to break, matters of seconds of computing power as opposed to months. In 1967, the Crypto AG rolled out an all-electronic model. And this was very much in vogue then because most of the nations were impressed by the advent of electronic cipher machines, and everybody wanted one. And overall, the CI connection was good for Crypto AG's business, because as you see here, the turnover and the margin both increased as a function of time. And if anybody's ever been in business or part of a company, 10 to 12% margin is a pretty good margin. But finally, Hagelin was ready to retire. So lock, stock, and barrel, he decided to sell off the company. France, West Germany, and other European nations had either been told about the arrangement with crypto or had figured it out on their own. So in 1967, the French offered to secretly buy Crypto AG with the Germans. Hagelin rebuffed this offer, and France had left the NATO alliance in 1966. So this would have left critical information outside of NATO, and he was not at ease with that. In 1969, the Germans came back, this time in partnership with the US. The CIA director approved the idea and said the French would have to be shut out. But anyway, here's the logo of Crypto AG. In 1970, Hagelin secretly sold Crypto AG to the CIA and the West German Security Service, which I'll refer to as BD. Apologies to German speakers in the audience. I think this is Bundesnachrichtendienst. The two agencies combined to buy Crypto AG for $6 million. The CIA called Crypto AG Minerva, which is the title of the history. The operation was first codenamed the Thoris, although in the 1980s it was changed to Rubicon, the name by which it is generally known. So what had the CIA bought? As these quotes from the CIA report are illustrative. The payoff went beyond the penetration of the devices. crypto's shift to electronic cipher machines buoyed the business. Foreign governments clamored for those systems that seemed clearly superior to the old electromechanical devices, but in fact were easier for US spies to read. The company always made two versions of this product. Secure models will be sold to friendlies and rigged systems for the rest of the world. Not only did the CIA control to which countries readable equipment was sold, but by designing the crypto logic for the next generation, the NSA had provided a mechanism to insert exploitable machines anywhere. As the highlight paragraph said, it was the intelligence coup of the century. Foreign governments were paying good money to the US and West Germany for the privilege of having their most secret communications read by other nations. So the illustrations here are examples of other crypto equipment. They sold a number of systems across the tactical and strategic spectrum. Another thing to note is that they could manipulate, the CIA and BD could manipulate where the company made its sales pitches. And if the CIA was more interested in certain nations like Saudi Arabia, Iran, Yugoslavia, etc., that's where the sales pitch went. If you're interested in the fascinating question of how you make a insecure system look secure, this link deals with the art of the back door. Now, I just want to show you a diagram from the Washington Post article in 2020, to which I've added some annotation. This was very widespread in its reach. These are the countries that are known to have been involved. In dark green are the ones to which the units were sold. Now, there are even a couple of Warsaw Pact or Warsaw Pact aligned nations, namely Czechoslovakia, Hungary, Romania, to some extent Yugoslavia. We were selling machines that we could read to NATO allies, Greece, Italy, Portugal, Spain, Turkey, probably others, and to US allies in Asia, Japan, Philippines, South Korea, Vietnam. This more extensive map was published in the Sarah Mainwaring article on Rubicon. It just emphasizes that the pink or red essentially are target nations. Blue nations, dark blue nations are originating nations. Light blue are at least semi-witting. As Mainwaring says, the United States likely shared this information with Britain and its ex-dominions, so Australia, Canada, and UK. Switzerland was certainly aware of this. France was generally aware of it because they tried to buy Crypto AG, and Sweden is cryptanalytically precocious, so they were probably involved along with Finland. But to some extent, this information was shared among the blue collars. As you'll probably see from this map, it's pretty much the global north versus the global south. How extensive was it? According to the CIA report, in fact, the operation was so successful by the end of the decade, 1980, NSA was reading 82% of the traffic that came from the original mechanical Hagelin machines. But of the electronic machines that were sold by Crypto AG, NSA could read 96% of the intercepted traffic. There were other companies, which I'll get to in a moment, one of which was called Gretag, which were, quote, under control, unquote. The American-German partnership on Minerva continued for 20 years. To the Americans, it was about 40% of NSA's total machine decryptions, and it was regarded as an irreplaceable resource. To the Germans, it was even more important, accounting for 90% of their diplomatic product reports. Hagelin's side of the story, unfortunately, is missing because he fell ill late in life. Apparently with his approval, though, the CIA sent an officer to Hegelin's office because they were afraid that the correspondence in his business records would blow a lot of secrets. So they accumulated those files and sensitive files and moved them to the CIA, where, according to the report, they reside to this day. Now, I just want to emphasize the implications for world history, all of which are mentioned in the CIA report, but the specifics are classified. What happened during this time period? There were the wars between India and Pakistan, coups in Chile against Salvador Allende, similar coups other places in Latin America, the Turkish invasion of Cyprus, the Camp David Accords, Billy Carter being caught on the Libyan payroll, the Iranian hostage crisis, the Falklands War, Libyan terrorism, the Iran-Iraq War. There are a couple of examples of them even reading the Vatican traffic in the manhunt for Manuel Noriega. The list is going to stop here because I have not found sources in the open literature on how later Rubicon intelligence was used. But to give you an idea of other events that occurred within the Rubicon timeline, they include the reunification of Germany, the invasion of Iraq by the US, the bombing of Somalia by the US, the Bosnian War and Dayton Agreement, the WC truck bombing, the India-Pakistani War in 1995, 9/11, and other crises. So the impact on the history of the world is essentially, I can't imagine that we weren't intensively interested in what other nations were saying amongst themselves during these crises. Unfortunately, the impacts will remain classified. So as in any agreement, there are generally tensions between the owners. It was generally agreed that NATO countries plus Sweden plus Switzerland were allowed to have very secure equipment. But as time progressed, the US pressured for Spain, Greece, Italy, and Turkey to get insecure equipment, i.e. readable equipment. Those are all NATO members after 1982. Germany reunified in 1993. And as the NSA report says, it was clearly NSA's policy to sell readable equipment to everyone. Germany, on the other hand, was opposed to selling readable equipment to its allies. It was no longer divided and was now part of the European collective. Germany wanted to belong and to cut ties to old ethically questionable decisions. But on this account, and due to a close call, which I'll describe in a moment, BND sold its share of the company to the CIA. Pro tip: if ex-Nazis tell you your decisions are ethically questionable, it may be time for some serious self-introspection. After the BND's departure, however, and using cash amassed from the crypto operation, the CIA secretly acquired, it only refers to, a second cryptography firm and propped up a third without identifying whom they were. The excerpts from the CIA report do not disclose details about these transactions. However, later news reports in Egypt, in Germany, and in Switzerland certainly do. And they mention one specifically, Cryptog. Now, Cryptog. Other companies became involved in this morass. Siemens in Germany and Motorola in the USA became the conduits through which the German intelligence services and the NSA, respectively, funneled the NSA-developed analog algorithms and instructions to Crypto AG. Starting in 1991, the CIA, as it said, subverted Crypto AG, and in 1995, the Cryptog business, this business was taken over by a company founded by two former NSA employees. So even more companies were involved, and the CIA targeted international bank transactions, which do not immediately fall under the heading of diplomatic and military communications. My impression is. The CIA report said it was the intention of the Americans to get control of the encryptors that were used for the SWIFT interbank communication system. Apparently, Grotag had sold those to another company by the time they were acquired. But to cut through a lot of details, Omnisec itself was manipulated by the CIA, according to the Swiss public television and to the German newspaper WOZ. Now, these accounts are all consistent about Grotag or Omnisec, but they're not very detailed, and they cannot be corroborated with any external source. So I can only report them with that caveat. How did this arrangement fall apart? In the 1970s, crypto AG engineers were trying to do their jobs, and they periodically came across back doors, and they began to raise a ruckus internally. Why is this flaw in the algorithm here? So eventually the CIA and BD were forced to hire an academic expert in cryptography who the engineers would listen to, but who was actually in league with the intelligence agencies to give the impression that all was okay. Occasionally, engineers nevertheless fixed backdoors in the algorithms of particular clients, and the CIA would inquire, why is Syrian traffic unreadable? And they would find out because a certain engineer helped the Syrians out by fixing a backdoor in their algorithm. An example of this is Argentina in 1982, where suddenly some aspect of Argentina's communications suddenly were secure, and Argentina noticed. The cracks in the wall started to appear in 1977 when there was a biography written of Friedman. It's not a particularly good biography, but I remember it held me up when I read it way back when because of the following paragraph. They're referring to Friedman's missions to Europe in the late 50s. And they said, it is significant that the NSA letter stated there were serious concerns about what might be revealed of Colonel Friedman's missions, since this might deprive NSA of having the daily information enabling the NSA to read clandestinely all NATO countries' messages. That raised a lot of eyebrows. It started to become generally known. James Banford's later book called The Postal Palace added a little more detail. I'm sorry, I've gone on, Mark, for too long with seeing your question. What is it, please?
Yeah, no problem. Actually, I have two questions. On the first paragraph there, you talk about the engineers fixing the back door. Were those NSA engineers? Were they American or whatever? And my second question is about Argentina in '82. That was the year of the Falklands War. Did we realize the flaws after, during, or before the war?
Both good questions. The engineers who found the problems were unwitting engineers hired by Crypto AG. So they were employees of Crypto AG. They hadn't been let in on what their company was doing. And yes, in the second reading, the Falklands War made the Argentinians strongly suspect that the British were reading their mail. And they asked Crypto AG about it. Amazingly, Crypto AG was able to allay their concerns, and they continued to buy Crypto AG equipment. But various things becoming known at different times began to tip off users that something was up.
Very interesting. Thank you.
The situation wasn't helped by the fact that in 1986, Reagan went on television to say irrefutable evidence, quote unquote. The US had obtained irrefutable evidence that the Libyans were involved in a certain form of terrorism, which came from their embassy's crypto traffic. So he was telling the Libyans very clearly, intentionally or unintentionally, we can read your mail. So clients started to have serious security concerns. And in 1992, Iran was so upset that it even imprisoned a visiting crypto AG salesman and held him for $1 million ransom. As you may infer, he was not pleased and he started to ask very uncomfortable questions when they released him. The US refused, by the way, to join the BD in paying his ransom. The CIA said, legislation prohibits us from paying ransoms. The BD was not convinced. The publicity surrounding his kidnapping and from these earlier disclosures finally, convinced clients that machinery being sold by Crypto AG was not reliable. At least half a dozen countries cut their contracts. Surprisingly enough, Iran continued to buy equipment from them, but enough countries suspected that something was wrong, that was a real problem. Bureaucratic inertia kept some customers on board. According to the German news article, Italian traffic was being deciphered as late as 2001. Finally, however, Crypto AG was liquidated because nobody believed in it anymore. And there were further revelations in 2020, as I've intimated. One was by a Swiss parliamentary investigation found that the Swiss government had been well aware of what was going on since 1993 and helped cover it up. As many of you know, Switzerland has a deeply ingrained cultural and political commitment to neutrality. This pretty much shredded it. As any operation has, there are unintended consequences. The trouble with backdoors is that other people can find them and open them too. We know that at least two Eastern Bloc nations, East Germany and Cuba, found and exploited built-in weaknesses of Crypto AG machines to read the other nations' traffics. You can actually, when East Germany merged with West Germany, a lot of their files became available, and you can actually see reports describing the decipherments. Presumably, they shared some of this information with the Warsaw Pact of the Soviet Union. So the thing that in retrospect is so surprising is the methods used in the so-called intelligence coup of the century ensured that some of its fruits were shared with principal US and German adversaries. And that included the secret traffic of some of their allies, people who would have been fighting alongside them in a shooting war. The effects of the inevitable revelation, because eventually everything comes out, West Germany suffered more damage to its reputation. Switzerland's reputation was shredded. This was another operation, another instance of the global North versus the global South. And most importantly, information technology companies became known as pawns of government security establishments, as they are to this day, with Huawei, TikTok, and Kaspersky, just to name a couple of fast examples. But Siemens, Motorola, and the crypto system selling companies were the pawns of the respective intelligence agencies, and everybody became impressed with that. Sorry, going the wrong way. As it said in this article about German-American cooperation during Rubicon, the full story of Operation Rubicon has not yet been unraveled. Its narrative interweaves with the complex cryptographic histories of more than half the countries in the world, and indeed much of our own recent industrial history. So much of what Crypto AG affected, is still unknown. Now, final thoughts, these are just my own thoughts about expediency and morality. A couple of things to think about as questions. with regard to diplomacy, a nation needs its allies and its neutrals to trust it. Rubicon made potential allies and neutrals vulnerable to manipulation by the large powers. And although crypto snooping had become frequent, it wasn't quite normalized at that time. And a couple of examples of it are as follows. I have trouble running down the initial quote, but one of the first messages that Churchill sent Roosevelt at the start of the American entry into the Second War was a carefully worded statement that I have directed our cipher agencies to stop attacking your ciphers. There's a lot to unpack in that phrase, but it indicates that it was assumed that allies don't read each other's mails, and as a courtesy, I've stopped trying to read yours. In fact, the British had been reading quite a lot, and formally they ceased. The reaction, there was, go further back in history, people may remember the Washington Naval Conference. The Americans were reading the Japanese codes, knew the Japanese negotiating position, and were able to crowbar the Japanese into what to them was an unfavorable tonnage ratio for capital ships. The reaction in Japan, public reaction in Japan, when this became known, was widespread outrage. So at least in that era, it wasn't quite accepted that allies read each other's mail. And again, this looms very large to me. Some of the nations we were spying on would have been comrades in a shooting war. In effect, we would have been orders to our own armies. We'd say, we're moving, if the Eastern Bloc had attacked, some of what we ordered would have ended up in allies' communications. Why would you expose your own communications to your enemy? And ask Turkey how it feels about all its secret messages being read by its rather large and mean neighbor, the USSR. There are, I think, genuine issues about human rights. Minerva probably revealed pretty egregious stuff about the coup in Chile and elsewhere in Latin America. We can't realistically claim to have been ignorant of what those governments were doing. Minerva shredded Switzerland's traditional and culturally ingrained neutrality without the democratic process. No one asked the people of Switzerland, a democracy, how they felt about this. We put people who worked for Crypto AG, like Bueller, who didn't initially know what was going on, in harm's way without their knowledge and consent. With regard to issues of privacy, well, when does a bank transfer stop being a personal matter and become an international one? When it's done by a company? When it's done by an individual? I speculate this aspiration to global eavesdropping may have inspired or normalized programs that allowed the NSA to collect information along the lines of the Snowden revelations. Just to make a brief reference to those, somebody once asked Snowden, a German broadcaster, asked him, what could you do if you use X key store, which is one of the joint American-British programs introduced that Snowden referred to. You could read anyone's email in the world, anybody you've got an email address for, any website, you can watch traffic to and from it, any computer that an individual sits at, any laptop that you're tracking. Interestingly, most of the nations participating in the programs he was talking about were read into Rubicon, which preceded them. And the eavesdropping involved collusion of large transnational corporations, which started with Rubicon, although the difference is companies were paid for making internet data available. And of course, this also raises the issue. When you're talking about encryption standards, can we really trust the NSA to review and pass on encryption systems that are really effective for the rest of us? Everyone remembers the famous story of the mysterious 56-bit key length of the DES which apparently was a compromise. Secure enough so that it couldn't be routinely broken by anybody in the field, but short enough that the NSA could break it if it really needed to. Some last final thoughts, getting down to, well, details of business ethics, perhaps not so important, but Hagelin sold equipment knowingly designed to be insecure. That is the start of the program. It was, I will sell what I choose to whom I choose. And it turned into, I will sell equipment, clients' equipment that's designed to reveal their secrets to third parties without their knowledge. Transnational companies became pawns in national security establishments, often with significant impact on their reputations without consent of their shareholders. How many shareholders of Motorola, Siemens, etc., were consulted about how they colluded with the CIA and the BD? And essentially, crypto AG employees were occasionally fired for, as a fellow techie, I feel for them, essentially doing their jobs. Final thoughts. The principal's final defense is that, well, it worked, it was of some use. Bobby Ray Inman, who is the director of the NSA and deputy director of the CIA in the late 70s, early 80s, when confronted, said, "Do I have any qualms? Zero. It was a very valuable source of communications on significantly large portions of the world important to U.S. policymakers. A minister of state under Helmut Kohl said, it helped make the world a little safer and peaceful." So the only defense for this, and certainly the only defense that principals offer, is, well, it worked. But I wonder what kind of world it's left us with. So finally, a word on sources. In a way, this is a snipe hunt, because all these sources, the Washington Post, the Baltimore Sun, a couple of articles in Journal Intelligence and National Security, refer to this CIA report, which is the basic source for all the material in this presentation. They all give a consistent picture of it, and I haven't found a lot of inconsistencies, but I can't see the blasted report itself. Some of these journal articles make extensive and specific references to the CIA report, like page numbers, but don't give any specific citation that tells you how to get to it. And finally, Crypto Museum apparently has an unreleased and undrafted copy. The copy contains real names of people, and it will therefore not be released publicly. So I have to tell you at the end of the game that essentially it's like hearing an elephant described from 6 or 7 points of view. It's pretty clear the elephant exists, but I myself haven't seen the elephant. Crypto Museum is a wonderful series of sources on cryptography and cryptography in general. And in this, they have very high credibility. You can find out about each of these things in detail at the respective links. The story about Bill Friedman and his archive is given in several places. There's a particularly good article about it, which describes the frustrating extent to which NSA tried to, what's the right word for classifying after the fact? But that's what they were trying to do. If you're interested about the M209, there's a brief and accessible introduction to it on YouTube, which actually is really excellent. It was written by one of the fellows who wrote the Cryptool cryptography package. There are a number of sources available. And if you're interested on US cryptography during the Cold War in general, these are two pretty good books. And with that, I can stop sharing. I'm sorry, and answer any questions if I can.
So I have a couple. One is logistic. Since you just ended with those citation pages, would you be willing to throw the text of those, the links, all of that, perhaps into the meeting chat for this particular meetup, so people could
Sure.
get to those links more easily? That would be lovely.
Let me go there. let me, oh, here we are.
I have to do it the second, but and then the question I wanted to ask was, you talked about you said they didn't. It wasn't like a physical back door. It was like a theoretical back door, like made it mathematically vulnerable in some subtle. Can you shed any light on?
For instance, the M209, for just to use an example, can be set up certain ways where you can put the lugs, you can arrange the lugs and bars so that some letters turn the print wheel a lot and some wheels turn the print wheel almost not at all. And in that case, you can, if the analysis is complicated, but essentially some wheels almost drop
more
out
regular.
of the equation.
Yeah,
Sorry?
you're making the patterns more regular in part.
Right. You can set up keys. So I described the key space as 3 times 10 to the 60th, I believe. You can make large swaths of that key space disappear by the way you choose your keys.
So that was the 209, but it was the 52 that became the big Rubicon seller.
Right. They could specify ways to select combinations of lug settings and wheel settings that would make some of those settings drop out of the key space. And essentially they could, you can easily, perhaps you can see that you can easily write a computer program with too many loops in it and a big loop that runs around all those little loops. That's sort of analogous to what they did. Is that at all illuminating?
The first thing you said felt more illuminating than the last, but that's fine.
Well, I can write a lot. Okay. Mark, I'm sorry. Is that your hand up?
Yes, it is. But I've already asked like 6 or 8 questions. So I'd let if anybody else has a question, I'll cede the stage.
Ask 8 or 9.
Manners.
You both talked at the same time. I think you said go ahead. I have a French question and then a German question.
Uh-oh.
Yeah, and they both clash. The French question is, as of July 1940, the Germans must have had hundreds of these. Oops, I apologize. Hundreds of these. Well, I forget what's the 209, the French example, the tactical one. What effect would that have had overall? Because the Germans would have had captured the machines, they would have had the ciphers and everything. And then the other question, the German question, is.
Let me do one French question first, and then I'll ask you what your German question is.
Sure.
The answer to the question is not very much, for no effect on anyone else, much more than the French, because the Germans would presumably capture a great deal many C-36 machines with key lists, which would enable them to read all the French traffic they wanted to, that had been sold that had been sent as long as those key lists were operative. The problem is that a basic tenet of cryptography is the security of the system does not reside in the machine, but in the keys you set. So the Germans, having an example of a pin and lug type machine, would learn all about pin and lug machines. That would help them to a certain extent understand how to cryptanalyze traffic by other nations sent by M209s, but it wouldn't have revealed the traffic. Even if you had the machine, the enemy's machine, you didn't necessarily know how to read the traffic on it.
Natural enough.
Unless you had the key.
Yeah.
Unless you had the key list. That is, for example, why there was such a hunt for Enigma key lists during the Second War. Because because of operations of various intelligence services prior to World War II, people basically knew how the Enigma worked. It was just a question of knowing what the key lists were in order to read the traffic.
Understood. My German question is one thing that I was kind of a little surprised that I didn't see is, given how the West German spy agency was riddled with East German spies, I'm surprised
That's
that
a
the
great
East-
question.
I-
I already love that question.
I don't see how didn't the DDR find out about this via the West Germans?
Oh, we're fairly sure they did, because Cuba and East Germany independently found that a lot of some of the crypto systems being sold to other people
yeah.
had backdoors in them.
Yeah, you had that in your presentation. I'm surprised that the East Germans didn't find it directly from from their spies in Bonn.
Well, I can't speculate about, what they knew. They knew something, but how much they knew is beyond classified doors at this point.
Okay. Okay. Thank you.
You're quite welcome. If people want, I have a few minutes to deal with the HX63. Would people be interested in hearing about that reentry?
I've never heard about it, but I'd love. Yeah, everything's been great. So yeah, please.
Okay.
So orient us back in the story. This is
Okay. There was a lot of squabbling because NSA wanted to standardize on a machine called the KL7, which was an American cipher machine and was probably more secure than the Hagelin machines, because the NSA was really a big advance. So NSA wasn't wild about it, the agreement. Eventually it participated, but it wasn't wild initially. The NSA told Hagelin that, no, we're not going to buy your machine. We're going to use ours instead. And this was a blow to Hagelin because NATO was a big market. He'd hoped to get that market. So, but on the other hand, the CIA has been, to use the vernacular, screwing around with him by continuing to sell M209s to a lot of nations who asked for them, and taking an awful long term, 9 years to settle on terms with him. And he was becoming a bit concerned, possibly. And what he did was that, I'm going the wrong way again. Yeah. Eventually, so Friedman visited Hagelin again in 1957, and Hagelin said, look at this new thing I've just patented. He'd patented in the United States a new type of cipher machine. There was a pre-existing US patent that was classified that should have interfered with that patent, but the US Patent Office, being what it was and is, failed to find that and granted Hagelin the patent on the new type of cipher machine. And what the new type of cipher machine was one that uses a principle known as re-entry. And this really scared the NSA. What re-entry is if you look at the diagram here, in a machine like Enigma, you have a fixed input and a fixed output and a couple of rotating disk rotors here in the center. So letter comes in from the keyboard to the fixed input A, and it goes on one side of one rotor and comes out as another, and transposed to a letter, and then to another rotor, and out finally that rotor as another current and another fixed output V. So A is transformed into V. The important thing is, in Hagelin's machine, there were 41 contacts around the sides of the rotors. You only need 26 of them for encryption such as this. What did the other 15 contacts do? And the answer was, for some of those contacts, something would come in from a fixed input, and it would go through one rotor and then through another rotor, and would come out. Instead of being another letter, it would be redirected through the entire stack of rotors once, or maybe twice, or maybe even 3 or more times. And so essentially, this greatly increased the security of the machine. Depending on where the rotor was in its rotation space, the letter might come out as a single letter, or it may go through the rotor many other times and come out as yet another letter. But it wasn't possible to relate the output of one rotor to the motion of any rotor involved. This is a great advance and made the key space much more complicated. If you knew the wiring of all the rotors, for instance, we were discussing in the last question, it still resulted in a very large key space of 366 bits, or more than 10 to the power of 109. If you didn't know the wiring of the rotor, it was 1360 bits to a number that I can only say is truly astronomical. So what Hagelin was threatening to do, essentially, was make a machine every bit as good or probably better than the KL7. It turned out that he made a number of those machines, which were known as the HX63. 12 are known who have gone to the French police, who put them in a basement, and the others, it's not known where. But that's because Hagelin found out about this reentry principle. This reentry principle is different than what Sagaba used. Sagaba used a novel way of very irregularly stepping the rotors. Reentry builds upon that process because not only are the rotors stepping irregularly with respect to each other, for about a third of their contact, about a third of the time, the current is re-injected to the rotor stack 2 or more times. And that makes cryptography incredibly complicated. The HX63 according to the Crypto Museum, was very arguably one of the most sophisticated rotor machines ever to be taken into production. And it would have been very difficult for the NSA or the CIA to manipulate it, and very difficult to break it. So essentially, I infer without the primary references readily available to me, that Hagelin got tired of being jerked around by the CIA and decided to strike back. It's not clear that this was his original idea. He seems to have found out about it through his contacts within the cryptologic equipment community within Europe, but nevertheless, he built a machine that implemented it. One thing that I think comes out for this is that Hagelin was, I really should go back to the slide. Hagelin was one very clever dude, and he has had immense influence on the history of cipher machines, because so-called pin and lug machines were the primary cipher machines for much of the world for most of the time. And I don't think there was a major advance in machine cryptography that he was not aware of at a fairly intimate level, or to which he did not contribute. And I think he's a very unsung hero of the modern age. I'm sorry, so are there any more questions I can answer?
One last one, if you don't mind. I know this started in Rubicon started in '64, was it?
It was for I have to be careful about names here. The gentleman's agreement started in 1960. At that point, a code word was assigned, which was Minerva, and it was, I'm trying to find it. Come on.
Yeah, that was there. Yeah, I remember there was a slide with that.
It was initially referred to as Minerva. I believe that code word was assigned in 1960, and then subsequently it was known as Rubicon. I like the implications of the term Rubicon as crossing a line.
Yeah, true. Didn't some of this story go back into the 50s?
What do you mean by go back into 50s?
Wasn't the beginning of this in the 50s?
Oh, yes. The gentleman's agreement, so to speak. A Rubicon grows out of Minerva, grows out of the gentleman's agreement. The gentleman's agreement really was initially an agreement between two friends, Horace Hagelin and William Friedman. And they started discussing it in 1951. And Friedman tried to implement it. Let me get the years right. I think 51 and 53. Let me get the years right for you. They started to discuss it in 1951. I think the first visit with serious effort to try to negotiate it was in 53. Yeah, 1953, this is the first visit where Friedman tried to negotiate it with Hagelin, and they struck an agreement.
Yeah, that's what I was saying. That's what I remembered. Okay, so that was to set up my question was, did any of this have any influence on the Suez Crisis in 56?
No, it did not. That is an excellent question. Oh, sorry. The shortest answer is, most correct answer is, I don't know. But this was one important, I think this was one important impetus between the Americans and later the Germans wanting to know what the British and French were saying amongst themselves. Because the Suez Crisis, for the rest of the audience, was essentially an attempt by the French and the British in league with the Israelis to grab the Suez Canal after Nasser in Egypt tried to nationalize it. And it was so obvious a neo-colonial land grab that the US, specifically Eisenhower, would not support it. The British at that time, because of our opposition and apparent foreknowledge of it, thought that we were reading their mail. I don't know if we were or not, but the agreement itself doesn't come into there was some agreement onto which, in the late 1950s, as to what cipher machines could be used by whom and which were penetrable. Presumably, the Egyptians were sold readable machines. So it's possible that the Egyptian communications were readable by the Suez Crisis on account of this agreement, readable to the US.
Thank you.
So I have a question. It was something of a segue in this presentation, but it piqued my interest. The wife who worked on mob communications. I hadn't ever really considered that the mob would use what level of cryptology, what level of cryptography did they achieve, make use of? Do you add any more to that story?
There were a lot of World War I veterans who had used cryptographic systems who were unemployed and floating around, and radio operators who were all too eager to work for sufficient pay for the Rome runners and and it was a very large business. I can't quote a figure to you, but it was hundreds of millions. I feel it was on the order of hundreds of millions of present day dollars. I don't know what it actually was. And this article in Cryptologia here, which is freely available online, shows examples of some of the systems she wrote. And it's really fun to read because it's not fun to try and labor through the messages. In some cases, but some of the copies have hand-scrolled messages in the upper left-hand corner saying, "Show this to Mrs. Friedman," i.e., I can't make head or tail of it, roll out the cannon. But some examples were encrypted in one system and then encrypted in another system. I mean, these people were desperate, but the lady was bright enough to follow them through it. And she was also very good on the stand, apparently, because the rum runners' lawyers would get her on the stand and try to prove that you didn't break this message, you made it up. And she would say, no, I didn't. There's only one solution to a cryptogram, and that is the plaintext. And I can show you why. And she was very persuasive with juries who were full of lay people. So she did a good job in the courtroom. She did a good job in the code room.
So
she is listed as the first female cryptographer in the US in the NSA Hall of Honor.
Does she predate What was the woman you mentioned in the last presentation that was, I guess that was early World War II, so I guess that was a little later. Okay, but
yeah.
I can't think of her name. But back to the mob. So were they using simpler ciphers? Were they using any of these mechanical enciphering machines?
They were not using machines.
They were not using machines.
Yeah, this was in the 20s. They were not. Apparently they did not have access to Enigma or Hayburn machines. They were, however, every other type of cipher you can think of, and then some. They had transposition ciphers. They had book ciphers. They had extensive codes. They had enciphered codes. She managed to get through that. She enciphered codes she was not so successful at, because those involve an awful lot of work. You need a lot of traffic. And generally these words would be that. What was impressive about her is the cryptanalyst is successful when he or she is presented with a lot of encrypted text. She was generally presented with only a few messages. And basically by the time she had a few messages, they were toast. She knew how to break the systems.
That's interesting.
So Bill held off the Japanese and the Nazis, and she held off the mob.
Yeah. I have a question. I'm not sure that you can answer or not. You mentioned that even with the modern computational power, it would be kind of difficult to decode these mechanical devices.
Yes.
One would think that with modern technology, the way things are done, that's all electronic, I assume it would be significantly more difficult to decode the current technology, whatever that might be. So do you have any idea how much more complicated the modern devices or electronic devices are to decode in comparison to old mechanical ones?
I'm not an authority on this. I can quote the key space sizes that are quoted for modern encryption systems, but a large key space does not necessarily indicate good security, as I've shown here. Most modern encryption systems, and I'm open to correction if I'm wrong, have key lengths of 256 bits. That is, you have to supply a key that's 256 bits long. And sorry, go ahead.
I'm sorry. No, I was just going to say they're fundamentally different. They're matrix equations. They're not mechanical rotors sequenced sort of things. So
That's, I mean, a rotor-based machine has a basic periodicity built into it, which is usually the period of its rotors. And a mathematical algorithm does not necessarily have anything like that periodicity, because as I showed at the start of the last presentation, for example, theoretically, Enigma has this immense key space, but in fact, by various forms of mathematical and electromechanical cleverness, Bletchley was able to reduce that to 170,000 for a 3-rotor machine.
Thank you.
Okay, are there any other questions? If not, I have a couple of items of business to discuss with Dave and Steve. I'm not going to kick anybody off, but if we're done with the presentation, you're free to leave.
I will stop the recording after praising Dave for yet another fascinating presentation. Thank you very much. That was really interesting.
Yeah, I don't have any questions, but that was really impressive.
That was awesome. Thank you.
I was amazed at how much you know about it.
Thank you very much. I learned so much from it.
I do have a question for Sue. I think are you the organizer?
Sort of.
Okay.
Question.
We're in an anarcho-syndicalist commune.
Oh, that's a Monty Python reference, I assume.
Yes.
My question is, this is the first time I've joined one of these. What's your frequency and what is